Welcome back. Good to have you back again. And now we're going to move to the next period of history in Rome, which is the Republic. In the previous video that we ran during the week about Livy, we covered the King period as described to you in Livy's first book. Now, as we switch to first Ovid's Heroides and then to Virgil's Aeneid, we need to start introducing to you the Republic, which of course is the period that is especially relevant for both of those two authors, because especially in the middle period, the conflict that Rome had with Carthage underscores the whole story of Aeneas' travels from Troy over to Italy, which unfortunately cross paths with the city of Carthage when Aeneas encounters Queen Dido and has a relationship with her that turns out not to work out well, especially for her. So understanding how this historical period forms the building blocks for the mythological history of the Republic that will underpin the works of Virgil and Ovid is really important for our ability to understand the motive for Roman myth, which again really has much more to do with the Roman state and its justification than anything about the specific stories that are being told. So once again, as I did in the previous introductory video, we're just going to tell very briefly what's happening here, and then in future videos we will start going into these points in more detail. So first of all, the Republic, as we talked about the previous week, started in 510 BC with the exile of the 7th king of Rome, Tarquinius Superbus, after the violent act of rape carried out by his son Sextus against the chaste wife of General Collatinus named Lucretia. Once the kingship fell, the Republic was established with a new governance that had up at the top 2 consuls. We're going to spend a later video talking in much more detail about Roman civics, the positions that are there. But for right now, it's enough to know that the kingship was abandoned permanently by the Romans. It never returned again. And the new form of leadership in the duration of the Republic were 2 consuls in charge of city administration in Rome. And by expansion, eventually also provincial oversight as well, although there were in fact different leaders directly in charge of the provinces, and that too we will cover in our later series of videos on civics. So okay, the early Republic goes from 510 BC down to 272 BC. This is the period of very gradual Roman military, cultural, and social expansion from just the city of Rome itself out into the various territories all up and down Italy. So at this point, the Romans are not really all that connected with any areas outside of Italy, except maybe through trade and maybe some commerce, especially down in the south, where a lot of those people were connected with Greek culture. So the Romans were definitely aware of the places all around, especially Greece, but wasn't necessarily trying to particularly interact with them in any close way, and certainly was not yet in a position to start militarily expanding. So the period of Roman expansion in Italy itself goes from 510 BC down to the year 272 BC. This is the final battle year in Italy, in which the Romans took over the southern city of Tarentum, and that secured the entirety of Italy as a Roman province outside the city of Rome itself. So that concludes the early part, because the next part of Roman history, beginning with 264 BC, is when we get the Punic War period. This is the period when the Romans begin to expand from Italy itself outward. They start getting involved with Sicily. Gradually, they also get more involved with Sardinia and Corsica. They, of course, will get involved with North Africa, eventually establishing that as a province when they come into collision with Carthage. And because it turns out that the Carthaginians had assistance from the east, the Romans eventually also move their expansion eastward into both Macedonia and Greece. 146 BC is a gigantic historical year for the Romans, a big watershed. It was the year in which both Carthage and Corinth, the head of the series of leagues in Greece, were destroyed. in two separate campaigns. As a consequence, the Romans were able to take in North Africa as one of its first major outside provinces, and also secured Macedonia and then eventually Greece itself as provinces over in the east. So Roman territorial expansion went really crazy in this period, and eventually established itself in three continents: Europe, Africa, and Asia in this whole period. There were, however, some unhappy consequences to this sudden, rapid expansion. It turned out the Romans really went too quickly and bit off more than they could chew. And some of those consequences began to make themselves felt in the late Republic from 133 BC down eventually to 31 BC, when everything completely fell apart for the Republic, and the Republic got turned into an empire. One of the main points here is, you may remember in the previous video that we talked about the patricians versus the plebeians. This is the dichotomy that existed in Roman society from the very early days of King Romulus, when he established the senatorial families as the patres, and then everybody else who was not part of those families became the plebeians. That tension never was really successfully resolved in the Republican periods, despite the many years of relative peaceability that the Romans enjoyed, and also the efforts that were made legislatively to give the plebeians some proper representation. It still wasn't really enough. The problem just sort of mutated from one form to another through this 5-century period. So it turns out that a lot of the hidden cracks beneath the surface in Roman society, having to do with these two social groups, finally would break out in all directions during the late Republic. And this ends up being quite a violent period of turmoil within the city of Rome and surrounding culture. And the Roman Republic failed to survive it, despite some concerted efforts by many leaders, notably Marcus Tullius Cicero, the famous orator, to try to save it. It simply had run its course, and it turned out that for all the well-wishing for the Republic that many senators had, and Cicero especially had, there in fact was no actual way to save it. So these are the periods of the Republic, and in later videos we will start talking about the historical events within the Republic as they are relevant to the author's works that you're reading. Okay, we will see you next video.